Hello, Neve from MatchMaker FM here. Coming up with a pitch for the perfect podcast is a fab feeling, isn't it? But now you've got to nail a name. Often with creatives, getting the foundation isn't tricky, the ideas are there. It's just the tying it together that can be a little bit difficult. See, nailing a name it's not so easy. It's not a walk in the park. So we've got a great video lined up for you today that should help. Yvonne Ivanescu came up with a 5-step plan that should really help you on your way to coming up with a great podcast name. So we've adapted today's video from that article because the thing is, in the ever-blooming world of podcasting, getting the right podcast name is key. It's the first thing people usually see, and normally it should describe in 5 words or less who you are, what you're about, and what you're making. You've got to let your listeners know what to expect from your show. But there's endless names out there. I mean, how do you know you've chosen the right one, you know? So let's learn how to make an unforgettable podcast name.
Are you looking for a podcast or radio show to appear on? Are you struggling to find a guest for your podcast or radio show? Let me introduce you to MatchMaker.fm. Simply create a profile, narrow your niche, and use the inbuilt messenger to contact potential partners. And the best part, it's free to sign up. So, let's find your match.
Before creating the world's longest list of potential podcast names, you must first identify your show's niche and understand how you want to present that niche. You really need to put some time into working out your target audience. Doing so will help you create a name that accurately represents your content and pleases your audience. Why is knowing your niche so crucial, I hear you ask? I thought that was a French tart, I hear you ask. Well, no, that's a quiche, and yes, it is very important. The niche, not the quiche. You see, a well-defined niche helps give a podcast a clear direction, but it also helps you stand out in a very crowded market. See, as of February 2023, there are 5 million podcasts out there. 5 million. 5 million. So how are you going to stand out? Well, if you're already at the podcast name picking stage, then hopefully you've already settled on a topic. So let's start there. You should have identified your genre, maybe had a look at gaps in the market. You should have solidified said niche without even meaning to by doing all of that. So all of this should help you understand how your show will be different and how you can craft the perfect name that highlights your... All of this should help you understand how your show will be unique and how you can craft the perfect name that really highlights that uniqueness. How to tailor your podcast name to your target audience though? Well, your podcast name should resonate with your target audience. It's often the first thing they'll find when they're browsing for new shows. Consider the following tips. Number 1, use familiar language or terminology. If your podcast focuses on a specific topic or industry, include words or phrases that your audience will easily recognize and relate to. Number 2, incorporate emotions or values. Choose words that evoke emotions and represent the core values of your podcast. This can help create an instant connection with potential listeners. Number 3, keep it simple and memorable, because a short, catchy podcast name is easier to remember and it's more likely to stick in your audience's mind. Have you identified your ideal podcast listener? Unfortunately, it can't be everyone, and I know you're thinking, why the heck not? I want literally 1 trillion listeners. It's fair enough, but we've got to be realistic, and it's important to be specific, and you really need to be thinking about how you can best serve them through your podcast content. By tailoring your podcast name to your target audience, you'll increase the chance of garnering genuinely interested listeners. Once you've identified your podcast niche and your podcast audience and your podcast quiche, I've got quiche on the brain now. Anyway, it's time to start brainstorming podcast name ideas for real. You can use several creative strategies to come up with a really memorable name for your show. Strategy 1, combine keywords and phrases. Here's some strategies as follows. Strategy number 1, combine keywords and phrases. One effective approach is to combine relevant keywords and phrases related to your podcast niche. This will help listeners quickly understand your podcast content, and it will really give them a general idea of the theme as well. To start writing down a list of words and phrases associated with your podcast niche. For example, if your show is about dogs, then you might want to use related words to that field, like Dalmatians or food bowls or bark bark or you know dog words. Dog words, everyone knows dog words. So, play around with the words. Put together different combinations to see what works and what doesn't. For example, bark bark woof time might not really be the best podcast name. I mean, maybe if your target audience is like Chihuahuas, but anyway, if you're stuck, there's also some online resources you can use. Just Google podcast name generator. It'll give you plenty of ideas. Just don't copy them verbatim, because there's a chance that like thousands of other people have used podcast name generators and just copied and pasted the results. So, tweak it a bit. You could also use popular keyword research tools like Moz. That way you could find really popular keywords in your niche. Strategy number 2, use alliteration, puns, or other wordplay. Creating a catchy podcast name can often involve using alliteration or puns. And yes, I know it sounds cringy, but it can often be really effective and quite cute and endearing. It can make your podcast more memorable and attention grabbing. Just make sure when you're using these to strike a balance between creativity and clarity. So make sure your podcast name is still easy to understand and relevant to your content. Don't make the pun too punny and too clever. Make it accessible. Try to avoid abbreviations and commonly misspelt words like, your and your. These can create a lot of confusion, especially if someone's trying to directly search for your podcast name. Strategy number 3, incorporate your name or personal brand. Another approach to consider is incorporating your actual name or the name of the brand you're working with. This can be especially effective if you already have an established following as a company, or even as an influencer, or if your podcast content is tightly linked with your expertise or experiences. Anyway, using your name or a personal brand can build a really strong personal connection between you and your audience. It can foster trust, it can build credibility. However, this approach might not suit every podcast, especially if you're not already fairly well known. It's unlikely people would be searching for your name. Sorry, I know you Google yourself, but that doesn't count. Avoid words like the or podcast in your name. They're often unnecessary and they take up precious space in the podcasty name. As technology evolves, the use of artificial intelligence has become increasingly popular. Interestingly enough, it's a great way of generating creative, unique names. AI name generation tools have advanced algorithms to analyze language patterns and create names based on specific input parameters, such as your podcast niche or target audience. These tools can quickly produce various podcast name ideas, offering the user a diverse selection. There are a lot of AI name generation tools out there, some specifically as well catered to podcasters. These include Welder Studio, podcast name creator, Orsha, podcast name generator, Nameify, podcast name ideas generator. Another option is ChatGPT. Just make sure you give it the correct information and prompts first. It's not always 100% spot on. It's pretty good, but not always. So are there any cons to using AI generated names? Well, yeah, there's cons to everything, right? Particularly when it comes to AI though. There are some to be aware of, including lack of context. AI-generated names may not always fully capture the essence of your podcast or resonate with your target audience. They can be overly complex. Some AI-generated names may be too complicated to understand, making them less memorable or appealing to listeners. While AI tools can create unique suggestions, they may not match the creativity and personal touch that human brainstorming can offer. So here's 3 tips on how to use AI name-generating tools effectively. Provide clear information. Be specific about your podcast theme, niche, and target audience. Doing so will help it generate more relevant and focused suggestions. Use with human creativity. Use AI-generated names as a starting point and then add your own personal touch to create something more meaningful. Do not solely rely on AI. While AI-generated names can be helpful, don't discount the power of human intuition. Combine AI suggestions with your own brainstorming efforts and incorporate feedback from friends and family. After all, as great as AI is, it's no comedy legend. The best puns, as they say, come from the heart. So, once you've got your long list, I'm sure, of potential podcast names, it's time to go through and see if any of these podcasts already exist. How about by starting the one that's the most unique and special to you, the one that sticks out the most? Obviously, a distinctive one will help you stand out more. If it stands out most from the list, then chances are it's going to stand out the most out there in the podcast market to your listeners. Search Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, whatever the case. You can even take this further and do a specific podcast search on Google. Just make sure to type the podcast name and then podcast next to it, just to see if it's pre-existing. But this should not be your only step. Make sure you've explored every avenue. You should also check domain availability for a potential future podcast website. And you need to make sure you're looking into social media handles that match your name. Why? Well, consistent branding across all your platforms will just help your listeners find you easily. If there's lots of podcasts out there with exactly the same name, then it's going to be quite difficult to fish you out the sea, so to speak. But what if the name that you love is already taken? Well, I'm really sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but if your podcast name is already taken, then I very strongly advise that you change the name. Now, bear in mind, you've already written a really big list of podcast name ideas, so don't worry, you're not completely stumped, even if it is a bit of a shame. The thing is, you just don't want to confuse your audience. They might accidentally discover another podcast while searching for yours. It's going to make it really difficult for your podcast to gain traction and really get some loyal listeners in. Plus, choosing a really distinctive podcast name is essential for giving yourself distinctive brand identity. When it comes to podcasts, you've really got to be thinking outside of the podcast. You've got to be thinking of the brand, the identity, the imaging of the podcast. That's where podcast marketability lies. Not to mention, sharing a name with another popular podcast could get you in hot water, legally speaking. There's all sorts of grey areas, trademark, intellectual property rights. You just don't want to go there. You don't want to go there. Go back to your list of finished ideas, pick another one, and repeat the process until you find one that's fresh and new. Before finalising your podcast name, be sure to test it with a target audience. That way you can ensure it resonates with your show's overall theme. To do this, simply ask your target audience whether your podcast name resonates with them. Do they like it? Is it attention grabbing? Would it entice them to click play? Would they change anything? Well, you can gather the feedback by conducting surveys or polls. Ask your audience to pick their favourite podcast name from your list of potentials. Is the one with the most votes the one you've chosen? Leverage social media. Share your list of podcast names on social media and ask your followers for their opinions and suggestions. Reach out to your network. Ask friends, family members or colleagues for their thoughts on your chosen podcast name. Do they like it? If they're wrong, like right off the mark, then it might be worth reconsidering your name. Revisit your podcast's primary goals and objectives too. Does your final name really align with your show's overall purpose? From there, ask yourself if your name really effectively communicates the meaning of the podcast, the essence, the heart. Most importantly, is it easy for potential listeners to understand what your podcast is about right off the bat? So, looks like you're ready to choose your podcast name, for real. Coming up with a podcast name is a bit of a commitment, just a bit, and it's not an easy task. But like we say, by being mindful of your target audience and bearing in mind your podcast's unique selling points, you can get the perfect podcast name that simultaneously grabs your audience's attention and also really speaks to the essence of your podcast. Remember, always be open to inspiration, whether it's from AI, whether it's from family, whether it's just from words you hear in the street, words you've heard on telling you thought, oh, that's a good word, that. Whatever it may be, take inspiration like a magpie. Little places like this, collect it, sit on it, think on it. And like I said, it might be scary, but don't shy away from getting feedback from your target audience either. Be brave, be brave.